Lecture 30, Dante Alighieri, Life and Works.
Well, I'd like to welcome you once again to our series of lectures on the literatures of Europe's Middle Ages. This is our sixth lecture, and the first of two that we will devote to the great Italian poet Dante Alighieri. In our next lecture, we'll turn to his greatest and most famous work, the Divine Comedy. In this lecture, we'll focus on his life, his times, and a variety of his other works, sometimes called his minor works, though I hope to persuade you that they aren't really so minor. Now, the times in which Dante lived were tumultuous, so some sense of this world and some sense of the works that he wrote apart from the comedy are very important in both placing him into context and then perhaps placing his comedy into context as well. Perhaps, all writing is somehow autobiographical, so it may be that Dante has inscribed himself deeply in all the texts that he wrote. So far in our course of lectures, Dante is the first author we will have encountered about whom we know a lot. Now, this provides us with an opportunity, but it also provides us with a challenge in trying to fit his work into his life and times. Now, in considering Dante's life and works other than the comedy, I want to suggest, by way of beginning, that we resist the temptation to force relationships among these works. We shouldn't really see all of his other works as leading to the comedy, nor should we use the comedy necessarily to interpret all of the earlier works, though it would be absurd to suggest that there are no links among them. Dante, then, was born in Florence in 1265 to a family of modest means. His mother died when he was just a young boy, and his father died when he was only 18, so he had to assume considerable responsibility for his family. Dante received a solid Latin education in a grammar school, but ironically, because his family wasn't rich, his education was not confined to Latin, and he read, early and eagerly, the vernacular poetry of France. In 1285, Dante married Gemma Donati, with whom he had 4 children, 3 sons, John, Peter, and James, named for the 3 apostles who witnessed Christ's transfiguration, and 1 daughter, Antonia. He was apparently a devoted father. In 1273 or 1274, Dante caught sight of the lovely Beatrice, probably the daughter of the prominent Florentine Folco dei Portinari. He fell in love with her. Her death in 1290 evoked major changes, as we shall see, in his thought and in his writing. Dante's family belonged to the Guelph party in Florence. Now, this was the party that generally favored alliance with the papacy and the independence of the Italian cities from the German emperors. In 1260, the Guelphs suffered a devastating military defeat at Monteperti. So Dante was born in a city dominated by the Ghibellines, the party that favored close alliance with the German Empire. Between 1267 and 1289, the Guelphs gradually returned to power, aided by the papacy on the one hand and by the kings of France on the other. Pope Boniface VIII, who was elected in 1294, angered many of the Guelphs, and most of all Dante, by his resolute efforts to dominate Tuscany, the region of which Florence is the greatest city. In 1295, Dante entered public office in Florence. In 1300, he served a 2-month term as one of the 7 priors of the city, a quite responsible position. In the 1290s, Florentine politics had become more complicated than usual, with the Guelphs divided into 2 bitterly opposed groups, the blacks and the whites. The sources make it impossible to identify all adherents or parties or policies. Dante was a white Guelph, we know that, and we know that his faction was expelled from the city in 1301 and 1302 with assistance from troops provided by Pope Boniface VIII. In 1301, Dante had been sent on a diplomatic mission, and while he was away in 1302, he was subjected to a decree of exile. From 1302 until his death in 1321, Dante was in exile from Florence. Now, he lived for various periods of time under the patronage of prominent urban leaders in various cities of Italy, and he finally settled in Ravenna, where he died in 1321, and where his remains rest to this day. Now, the decade of the 1290s saw crucial changes in Dante's life and outlook, beginning with his first major work, La Vita Nuova, The New Life, which appeared between 1292 and 1294. The death of Beatrice was a crisis for Dante, whose resolution taught him something new about what poetry is and what poetry is for. Previously, Dante had written lyrics and sonnets in fairly conventional ways. The new life of the title of La Vita Nuova is Dante's own life. He begins, as it were, a new life. Now, we can say that the work puts on display a characteristic that will be in evidence for the rest of Dante's authorial career. He self-consciously comments on poetry in general and on his own poetry in particular. Well, you might say, big deal. Poets writing about poetry certainly reaches back to the first poet who ever lived. Fair enough. But Dante does certainly have this self-reflective dimension in his writing from this point forward. Now, La Vita Nuova itself consists of poems, some old, some new, all Dante's, arranged by Dante within a frame or a running prose commentary. Okay, the tradition of commentary, commenting at length on a set text, was very old and very conventional. Dante doesn't innovate at all in doing this. As the poems and the commentary evolve, however, through 42 sections, convention slowly begins to give way to novelty, at least in the substance, if not specifically in the form. Now let's set just a little bit of context around the Vita Nuova. The troubadour poetry of France had first taken root in Italy, in Palermo, in Sicily, at the court of Emperor Frederick II. It was pretty conventional in themes and in content, but it was innovative in form in at least this respect. Giacomo da Lentini devised the sonnet, the 14-line poem that would have a very bright future in front of it in the history of European and indeed of the poetry of other countries and regions as well. Sicilian poetry was then imitated and finally superseded by a group of northern poets. Now, we could follow a variety of lines of affiliation here, but it seems pretty clear that those who were most prominent and who most influenced Dante, indeed some of them he knew, were Guido Guinizelli, Cino da Pistoia, and Guido Cavalcanti. And some of these figures actually turn up by name in some of Dante's later writings. Now, these poets wrote in what came to be called il dolce stil nuovo, the sweet new style. Hence, we call them the stil novisti, the new stylists. Previously, Italian poetry had stuck very closely to French conventions and issues. Fundamental was the notion that the love of a lady and the love of God were somehow incompatible. Well, we've seen this sort of thing already in some of our earlier lectures. The Stil Novisti theologized French poetry by asserting in some sense that the lady might lead a man to God. On one level, La Vita Nuova narrates Dante's love for Beatrice from their initial encounter to the time when she first greeted him, to the time at a wedding feast when he swooned in her presence, to her death, to his attempts to love others, and to his dawning understanding, or perhaps re-understanding, of love itself. On the most basic level, therefore, La Vita Nuova seeks to answer the question, what is love? Dante's predecessors had been obsessed with this question, and usually answered it in negative terms. Love is illusory. It brings disorder, confusion, even death. It subjects reason to passion. It focuses too much on the woman who cannot satisfy what ought to be one's deepest desires. That is to say, one's deepest desires ought to focus upon God. Dante's flash of insight, as he portrays it, mind you, he's styling himself for us here, is to see Beatrice, and here he played upon her name, as bringing blessing and beatitude, grace and happiness. He sees something new in Beatrice and through her in love. La Vita Nuova therefore becomes a story of the poet's education. Beatrice, he insists, is unlike any other woman who has ever lived. She is a miracle. Beatrice comes to stand for Christ in some ways. She can lead Dante, but she can lead all men to God. She becomes an instrument of salvation. We may say, in other words, that the poem is not so much about Dante's love for Beatrice, because in it, Beatrice becomes love. In formal terms, Dante turns around and reformulates positively the negative judgments of the Stile Novisti, which has led some critics to say, well, is he really a poet in the sweet new style? Has he in fact created something slightly different, not in form, but in meaning? There's something rather interesting about Dante's Vita Nuova. The work is daring, and it comes very close to blasphemy. But it never, as far as is known, called down a single word of condemnation from any theologian or any ecclesiastical authority. Perhaps, indeed, it was just too beautiful, and perhaps eventually Dante had become simply too famous. Now, it would be very difficult to go through and summarize this entire work except in the rather schematic ways that I've already provided here. But one way into it may be to quote a few lines from section 19. Now, this is widely regarded as one of the most beautiful poems in the collection. Remember, now we have poems surrounded by a prose commentary. This is the exquisite poem, Le donne che avete intelletto d'amore. Women who have insight into or who have deeply understood love. Now, this poem will, I think, help to give us a sense of the force and also the meaning of the work, and it'll give us some feel for Dante's poetry in the 1290s, years before he has written the comedy. It would, of course, be much better to read it in Italian, because the sheer music of the Italian is wonderful, but to read it out in Italian and then read the translation would take us a very long time. So, second best, we'll have it in English. To the all-knowing mind, an angel prays, Lord, in the world a miracle proceeds, in act and visible, from a soul's deeds, whose splendor reaches to this very height. One imperfection only heaven has, the lack of her. So now for her it pleads, and every saint with clamor intercedes. Only compassion is our advocate. God understands to whom their prayers relate, and answers them, my loved ones, bear in peace, that she your hope remains until I please, where one must lose her soon or late. And who will say in hell, souls unconfessed, I have beheld the hope of heaven's blessed. My lady is desired in highest heaven, now of her excellence I'd have you hear. If any such endured to look on her, he would be changed to good, or die straightway. To look at her, her virtue then he knows, for greeting him, salvation bestows, in meekness melting every grudge away. With further grace has God endowed her still. Whoever speaks with her shall not fare ill. Love says of her, how can a mortal thing have purity and beauty such as hers? Then looks again, and to himself he swears, a miracle she must be, as God intends. The years between 1304 and 1307, Dante was now in exile, saw two major but unfinished works, the Convivio, the banquet, and De Vulgari Eloquentia, on the eloquence of the vernacular. Exile brought a new crisis for Dante. He lacked authority in every way. He was not rich. He was not aristocratic. He held no public office. And he was beginning to be fairly well known as a poet, but he was by no stretch of the imagination famous. He wasn't yet Dante. He was merely a poet, and at that a vernacular poet. He had, in other words, no standing as a man of letters. Remember in our first lecture we mentioned that in the Middle Ages to be a lettered person you had to have Latin letters. Well, so far Dante had made his reputation writing Italian. Dante had no formal training in philosophy or in theology. And yet he presumed to teach important lessons. He believed he had important things to say. Beginning in the 1290s, again perhaps as part of the crisis following on the death of Beatrice, he began to read, or possibly in some cases to reread, very widely. He read Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. He read Cicero, a number of Cicero's philosophical treatises. He read St. Augustine's Confessions. He read Virgil's Aeneid. He read Virgil's Eclogues. He read scholastic theologians. And he certainly read directly or indirectly, always in translation or else perhaps in summary, Aristotle. Now, beyond this, Dante was always a very careful reader of the Bible. And as a conventional Christian, it's important to bear in mind, he would have heard the Bible in the liturgy again and again and again and again. These then are some of the kinds of literary influences that we can see operating on Dante and then operating in the works to which we'll now turn our attention. In the Convivio, which was written in Italian, Dante tried to claim authority by demonstrating his deep knowledge of the great tradition. Now this is interesting and important here. He's writing a work in Italian in which he addresses himself to the great literary tradition, which was fundamentally Latin. He's trying to show that he commands that tradition even if he doesn't write about it here in Latin. Nevertheless, he acknowledges that Latin is superior to Italian, that the great Latin writers had had more important and more interesting things to say than so far Italian writers had had, that the Latin language was a more supple, a more effective vehicle for communication than Italian was. There we may just drop in a parenthesis and say that Dante and the figures whom we'll meet in the next two lectures, Petrarch and Boccaccio, all had this very powerful sense that even though they were writing in Italian very often and becoming very famous for writing in Italian, they had this sense that Latin was superior, and they all in one way or another addressed themselves to that fact. What is ironic about this is that it was precisely these three writers, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, who created the Italian language as a literary tool and made it something that was supple, that was flexible, and that could communicate as effectively, perhaps, as any language ever has. Well, close the parenthesis and back to the Convivio. The work was to have comprised 15 books, heavily emphasizing a commentary on the virtues as they had been defined by Aristotle. I hope you just hear a little echo there of the Romance of the Rose. You see, this is one of the other kinds of influences on Dante. Dante knew that work. We have in the end only a discursive introduction, 2 books on how love for a woman is an allegorized love for Lady Philosophy. There's Boethius. Lady Philosophy is Boethius's guide when he is in prison, in writing his Consolation of Philosophy. And then finally, a truncated discussion of authority and nobility, in whom authority subsists and what it is, in whom nobility subsists and what it is. So we're in some difficulty here because we can't really quite see the architecture of the Convivio as it was meant to be. We don't have the whole work. There's no reason to believe, by the way, that anything was lost. Dante simply didn't finish it. We'll have 1 or 2 things to say about these unfinished works by Dante in a few minutes. Dante stressed that exegetes, commentators on the Bible in particular, use allegory to find deeper, truer meanings, while poets use allegory, one of the most famous comments by Dante, to tell beautiful lies. To tell beautiful lies. Now, the point here, this is something that we met briefly in our discussion of El Cid. The idea that verismo, The truth is not necessarily wrapped up in mere details, but the truth is something behind those details, greater than those details, more universal than any detail could ever hope to be. This is the sort of thing that Dante is driving at here, you see. These beautiful lies, it is their beauty that confers truth upon them, and that makes them, if not strictly literally true, truer than most things that are strictly literally true. He's also, of course, perhaps playing here. How he would have come upon it is hard to say. A remark by Aristotle. Now, Aristotle's remark is in his book, The Poetics, and that work was not translated and widely available till a couple of hundred years after Dante was writing the books that we're considering here. But Aristotle had once said that historians lie, but poets never do. That is to say, because historians tell only the ordinary details, and it's sort of like, well, who cares? But poets tell the greater truths, even though Aristotle would perfectly well have agreed that much of what one reads in poetry is not, strictly speaking, true. So there's an old warrant for the kind of insight that Dante has here. Beyond this, Dante is trying to establish his own authority as a poet. He's trying to establish the authority of Italian. He's addressing profound, sophisticated, complex problems in Italian. You see, this was something quite novel. And finally, he's trying to establish the authority of poetry. In other words, indeed, that poetry has its ways of telling great truths, or, as he called them, beautiful lies. In the section on nobility and authority, I'll just pull out one point because we've encountered it several times already and will encounter it yet again in future lectures. This insistence that nobility is something moral and not genealogical. In other words, once again, nobility is a matter of character. It is not a matter of blood. Now, in writing De Vulgari Eloquentia, here we have a delicious irony. This work is written in Latin, but it is the first book ever written in Romance linguistics. It is a commentary on the excellence of the vernacular, but written in Latin. Now, the Convivio, of course, the irony ran in the opposite direction. Here we have a work in Italian upholding the excellence of the great Latin intellectual tradition. So, is Dante, as it were, playing with his audience? No, I think he's trying to make, implicitly and explicitly, some very interesting points, some very important points, for him compelling points, about communication and the languages in which one can communicate. Well, De Vulgari Eloquentia was to have been in 4 books. Again, only fragments survive. Dante explores, first of all, the Romance vernaculars that use si, oui, and hoc to say yes. And then he goes through 14 Italian dialects. Now, from one point of view, his comments on these languages and so on are interesting enough in their own ways, but he's actually trying to make a moral point. He's making a point about human presumption after the erection of the Tower of Babel. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel, they were going to build this tower that would reach all the way to heaven, and for their punishment they were scattered to all the corners of the earth and given different languages. The multiplicity of languages in the world, Dante says, is a consequence of the loss of Eden, of the loss of purity, of the loss of kind of simplicity, which would have prevailed had not human presumption intervened. Now, what's the moral point he's making? Well, yes, Latin is excellent, and Greek was excellent too. Dante didn't know Greek, most of his contemporaries did not. But post-Babel, there were many languages in the world. Italian was one of them. And in some sense, therefore, Italian had an equal claim to all these other languages. There was no reason particularly to privilege one over another. Quite a remarkable claim on behalf of the vernacular, and again, ironically, articulated in Latin. Why are the works unfinished? This has puzzled critics, Dante scholars, for a very long time. Some have suggested that by the time he was writing the Convivio and the De Vulgari Eloquentia, the comedy was already underway and had begun to demand all of Dante's attention. That's possible, but not persuasive, it seems to me. Others suggest that Dante's real project was finished. He had claimed authority for himself as a vernacular poet, perhaps as much as anything working this out in his own mind, and he had claimed recognition of himself as a master of the great tradition. So it may be, you see, that what he really wanted to say, he had said. In any case, almost everything found in both of these works, De Vulgari Eloquentia and the Convivio, turns up in some way or another, by theme or by substance, in the comedy. So there may be the possibility, at least here, that these earlier texts were kind of trial runs. He was trying ideas on for size, and when he got them to fit, he kind of stopped and moved on. Between about 1310 and 1312, Dante wrote his treatise De Monarchia, on monarchy, on government, if you will. In this treatise, he asked three big questions. Is universal monarchy necessary or desirable? Second, did the Romans acquire rule justly, and did they exercise it honorably? Third, does imperial authority derive from God? Now, there can be no question that Dante was impelled to write this work by the extraordinarily complicated political conditions in which he lived, perhaps by his own experience of exile, perhaps by the fact that, in his view, the emperors of his days had failed to fulfill their responsibilities, that the popes of his days had exceeded their responsibilities. There's much rootedness in Dante's context in this work. It's also fair to say that Dante's answers to these questions are already adumbrated in the Convivio and in De Vulgari Eloquentia. And it's also important to say that they recur repeatedly in the comedy. But they get their fullest exposition, the answers to these three questions, in De Monarchia. Now, the emperor and the empire, for him, signify universal moral authority. The emperor is a ruler who has been chosen by God to lead the whole human family. It is his duty, Dante believes, to give practical force to the teachings of the philosophers. So the emperor is a moral force. He is to lead all people. He's not to govern them, to rule them, to push them around. He is to lead them to the good. He is to be a force for the good. And above all else, the emperor's responsibility is to restrain cupidity. Dante sees cupidity, I want stuff, as being the fundamental flaw that damages societies and hence human relationships. The Romans, Dante thinks, were like the Jews, in that they were a chosen people. But God particularly chose the Romans to rule all mankind justly. Moreover, he said, the Roman Empire provided the necessary conditions for the expansion of Christianity, so that the Roman Empire was intrinsically excellent and it was instrumentally excellent. That's not Dante's language, but we can put, certainly in those terms, the various points that he was making. God has placed two authorities on earth. He has placed the emperor and the pope. Now, the emperor's office, although it comes from God, is inferior to that of the pope, who is concerned with people's salvation. This is interesting. This reaches back to arguments and discussions that first appear in the letters of popes as far back as the 5th century. Popes then were situated inside the context of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire didn't have much longer to run, but they were inside the Roman Empire. And the emperors would from time to time bully the popes or try to dictate to them in theological matters or political matters or whatever it might be. And one of these popes, his name was Gelasius, responded by saying, look, there's two powers on earth, the power of kings and the authority of priests. Well, power, potestas in Latin, auctoritas, authority in Latin, were very loaded terms. The idea was that the emperor had his sphere, the priest had his sphere, but if they ever clash, then because the priest is concerned with souls, his authority is the greater, is the more significant. So Dante is not inventing this notion, he's standing in a long tradition. But Dante says, in order to do his job correctly, the Pope and the clergy generally should neither possess nor rule anything. Cupidity for wealth and power is destroying the church, in his view. But he is no less critical of the emperors who refuse to accept their responsibilities. Dante's is, we would say from our perspective, a work of political theology more than of political theory in the normal sense. And Dante never sketched an ideal polity, though in his conversations with his ancestor Cacciaguida in Paradiso, in the comedy, in 15 and 16 of the Paradiso, we get a sense that he longed for a simpler time when common decency prevailed. Thus far, the Dante before the Commedia. Next time, the Commedia itself.